Well, hey, everybody. Beards and Dunn are back in 2024. We've been on a little, what do you call it, Dick? A sabbatical
I guess
or
so.
something? A
Little
little
holiday break
vacation.
during
A
the
little,
during the holidays and stuff. But
ah,
gosh darn done, it's great to be back. And I'm telling you, I I'm like a little kid at Christmas right now. I mean, we
hey,
we
hey.
we couldn't be kicking off 2024 with a better guest than we have
oh,
today. And
y-
I am just
oh,
you know I
don't let the cat
I
out of the bag yet.
I've got butterflies in my stomach. That's how
I tell you,
excited I am.
well, Dick and I talked briefly right before we started, and our guest today really needs no introduction. I told Dick, Beards, I'd introduce him, and this is going to be quick because I don't want to waste time. Frank Shorter's, if you don't know who Frank Shorter is and some of his accolades, you have not done your homework. You have not been paying attention. And I'm going to put on our website and on our link to his website, and you can. It's really fun. I went there and looked at Frank's. I don't know what you call it. His Palomars, I think, is how they call it over in Europe. Here, his records, his accomplishments, and they go without. There's nobody to compare. And on a personal note, before we get started here, Frank, in 1972, I was a 15-year-old high school. I think you're 10 years older than me. I hate to throw that at you, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yep.
And so,
76.
yep. And so in 1972, I was just starting my running career, and you were coming into your own, obviously with the Olympic gold medal at the marathon, and what an inspiration. You've been kind of given the title of starting the running boom, and I like to think the boom would you definitely supercharged the boom, and it's hard to put into words. When I was out running, I tried to emulate your style. That's the kind of way kids look to. And I don't want to make your ego or your head too big, but you were an idol to many of us. And if the way you kind of had your elbows out a little wider than a lot of guys, and if it's good enough, Frank Shorter, it's good enough for me. And so money a training run, I would always kind of use the imagery, and I was out there running the Olympic 10K. I was out there running the Olympic marathon, and I was trying to be Frank Shorter, and it's such a treat. If my high school coach Gene Borman, and he's still living, and I think he still listens to this. If I, in 1972, when I was scouring track and field news from cover to cover, looking for results and reading about your exploits over in Europe or all over the world, if I would have known then that someday I'd get to have this opportunity to visit with you, you would have been able to knock me over with a feather. And before we go any further, one little last thing, Frank. Dick and I, when we met each other in college, we just hit it off. And I can remember going to a restaurant with Dick, and they said, "Yeah, what name should we put on this?" Because they'll call your name, go sit at the bar. And Dick goes, "Frank Shorter." And I looked at Dick, and he goes, "Mike, it's so cool. I always say Frank Shorter because then when he go, yeah, we have a table for four for Shorter, Frank Shorter." He goes, "You should just see all the heads in the room turn and swivel." And so I started doing it. I started doing it too because it's just now you know who you're dealing with. But
Oh.
Frank, I'm so honored, and it's such a pleasure. We're going to get into some good stuff. And Beards, your turn.
Yeah, well, again, Frank, we're going to let you do a lot of the talking here, but yeah, the accolades go out. You are. I mean, even non-runners know
Exactly.
who Frank Shorter is and what you did and everything. And so, Frank, let me ask you this: so, when you were a young kid, did you pick up running early in your life? How did you get started in this crazy career of being a top-notch distance runner?
Well, I actually wanted to be a downhill ski racer.
Oh.
And yeah, and when I was 10 years old, I grew up in a little town in upstate New York, Middletown, New York, near West Point. And I read in the ski mag, and I used to ski in the ski areas in New York. And I read in the ski magazines at that time, the French were the best in the world. Jean-Claude
Right.
Guy
Yes.
Perria, André Duvillard, and then the French women were also the best. I think it was Crystal and Marion Goichel,
Hmm.
the Goichel sisters. And so I read that in the off season, they actually ran for training. And the way I put it is the Austrians, whom they were dominating, uh, the way I put it is they went back to the farm and bucked bales,
Right.
whereas yeah, whereas the French were actually training by running. So I started to run, and I was about 10 years old, and I would run to and from school in this little town, and I lived on the other side of town from the middle school, and it was 2.3 miles, and sometimes I would run, sometimes take the bus, and the reason I have the form carrying my arms that Dunn was talking about
Yeah.
is that I used to carry my books in my left hand and cradling them because we didn't have backpacks. So I had the loose leaf and all my books
That is so cool.
in my left hand. So if you watch when I run, my right hand moves more and my left hand in relatively doesn't move much at all.
What a great
And so
story.
Yeah.
yes, that's where the form came from. And then I guess I must have been and I found out I really liked it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get better at it. So I found a pair of sneakers at the time, which would have been, 1960, 61.
Wow.
And they were low cut and they had thin soles rather than the thick soles that the sneakers had at the time. And I started to wear those to and from school. Well, it turned out that the school had a dress code and boys could only wear black tie shoes. And so I convinced the principal of the school to allow me to wear these sneakers because I was, quote, training. The other thing, when again, I was 10, 11 years old, in gym class, I convinced the gym teacher to allow me to run laps around the field, the exercise field, rather than participate in the gym relays and everything else that was going on.
Dodgeball and what
So yeah, and it turned out that when I then went to prep school, I went there as a skier. I went to it's now called Northfield Mount Herman. Then it was called Mount Herman. And they had a great ski team. They were in Western Massachusetts, in the Berkshires. And I was on the ski team before I was ever on a cross country team.
Wow.
And so, yes. And so I was a three-way skier. I jumped and skied downhill and cross country. But I was still kind of training on my own because of the French
Sure.
connection. and it turned out that I was pretty good at both. And at the end of my junior year, I was actually elected captain of both the ski team and the cross country team.
Wow.
Yeah, in prep school. And I, for whatever reason, and I think one of the reasons is any of you who have ever ski jumped, because we were three-way skiers. We jumped,
Oh my gosh.
downhill and cross country. But all it took, sort of in the middle of my junior year before my senior year, you work your way up in the jumps. And I got to the point where I was going off a 50-meter ski jump in Greenfield, Massachusetts. And I'll never forget, I stood at the top of this, and you carry your skis over your shoulder, right?
Yeah.
And you climb up these stairs. And I suddenly realized once you start climbing up the stairs, you can't say, "Oh, no, I don't think I'll do this." And you can't get off the ski jump. And so I got up there, and I'll never forget. And my wife, Michelle, gets on me all the time for these stories. But anyway, and she says I should write this stuff down. I'm standing at the top of the ski jump. I'm about 2 people to go. And it was totally wooden, the ski jump. And the in-run down the jump was through a very thin coat of snow, so that the tracks that they'd made in the snow going down this jump were very, very shallow.
Oh no.
And icy. Okay. And the guys ahead of me, I would look and they'd go down and the wind would hit the jump back and forth. And the the tracks would go back and forth underneath these guys' skis. There
Oh
was
my
no
gosh.
there was no stability going down there, and I thought to myself, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And so, to my credit, I jumped. I probably didn't jump very well. So when it came time the next year to make a decision, I decided in my junior year that I would cross only concentrate on running my senior year. And it was one of those situations where I had a wonderful coach. His name was Dick Kellum, and he was a very good skier. And I went in and I talked to him and I said, I'm having good success in cross country, and I've really decided I want to focus on that. And he said, that's fine. And he could have, made me feel guilty about, leaving the ski team. And he didn't. So that's my senior year. That's when I decided to focus on running. And then historically, I hope I'm not bragging too much, because we all know, right, Dick? You develop over your career. You go from a small pond to a little bit bigger
All
pond to
right.
a little bit bigger pond, and that's the way you should do it. And your goal is to always do as well as you can in the pond in which you find yourself at that particular moment in time. And the prep school league, our cross country team, were the perennial champions. With all the blue blood prep schools. I can mention them: Andover, Exeter, St. Paul's, Choate, Groton, Middlesex, that whole Eastern prep school league. Well, Mount Hermon was a very good cross country team. And so our cross country team, my senior year, I set a course record on every cross country course on which I ran. And we won the New England championships. And so that's when I kind of got the bug and said, maybe there's something I can do here in running. So, short story long, that's how I kind of got into
Well,
the
and
running.
Frank,
And Dick,
many people, know you as the Olympic marathoner and a marathoner, but my gosh, I mean, you won national titles in cross country and
Track.
It's I
Indoor
mean,
track.
it's off the charts. The amount of accolades and the amount of great running you did at other distances besides the marathon.
Now, before we get into that, Frank, did you get recruited? I know you went to Yale, if I'm not mistaken.
yes.
Did you get a
Yes.
scholarship, athletic scholarship?
Well, no, Yale, the Ivy League doesn't have athletic scholarships. In fact, they had at the time, and I think they still do, what's called need blind admission, which means you have a file which is that at which they look to begin with to see if you qualify academically. And then if you're admitted, they look to see if you require financial aid. So you file a financial aid statement with your admissions, but they never look at it while they're deciding whether or not you will be admitted. And the first couple years, I didn't need it because my father was a doctor in upstate New York, but then he moved my entire family, my 9 siblings and I, to Taos, New Mexico, and he became the head of a Presbyterian mission hospital between Taos and Santa Fe that serviced the indigenous Latino population. Indigenous is the wrong word. Well, no, it's a combined indigenous Latino Indian population that's in the Sangre de Cristo Rocky Mountains from the 1600s. So when they moved there, my junior and senior years, I was on scholarship, and my last year, I was on a full scholarship based on need.
I always wondered how the Taos, I used to have that little yellow pamphlet that said Frank Shorter. I think it came out shortly after in 72. Did Runner's World put that together? And
John Parker.
Oh,
John Parker wrote that.
Okay.
The same guy who wrote Once a Runner.
Yes. And I had a copy. And, when you came to the Dick Beardsley Marathon training camp and for the Dick Beardsley half marathon and that several years ago, I scoured and scoured my mother's, because I'm afraid, so many of those great treasures now that I wish I would have hung on to, it was gone because I would have had you sign it. But I remember in there, it had a lot of stories about Taos, New Mexico. And after you started really seriously training, I think you were living in a trailer. And I remember there's a story about it. It said the heat quit and you went out and the propane tank was sitting there and you didn't know what to do. You kicked it, it fell over and broke. And I think John Park.
Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah. The story was, what did you do that then? We froze. Is I think your quote. What's this?
Yeah, well, you and I would train at altitude and drive up to the Taos Ski Valley, which was the base area was 9,000 feet.
Wow.
And I actually sometimes would camp out in my car in a full, they had very good, garments even then, and so I was always warm, but I just instinctively enjoyed the running at altitude. And Dick can talk about this as well. For me, I also think mentally it was an environment, and Dick obviously did the same thing. You like to develop your training once you reach a certain level, to modify it in a way that you feel you're getting a maximum benefit, and in a way the people against whom you're going to compete wouldn't perhaps get the
Right.
same kind of benefit. You're specializing your training to a point where then you focus on it and you train that way as hard as you can. And I think part of the confidence is, I don't care if people know what I'm doing, because if they try to duplicate it, I don't think they're going to get the same result that I get.
Cool.
I want them to know. And so
Exactly.
running at 9 to 10,000 feet, and again, thinking you're training harder than anyone else. I can tell the Steve Prefontaine story now. He came to stay with me 3 months before he died in 1975, because he realized, and we'd roomed together a lot on the circuit, that we trained alike. We both trained like 5,000 meter racers. And he also realized that altitude worked. And so he was going to, and what do? You look for a mentor. Well, I was the mentor and he was the mentee. And he came to Taos. And it was just at the beginning of April. And we lived up at the ski valley at 9,000 feet. And every day, when we were up there, we were there about 2 weeks. We would ski in the morning. And then the other story about this is Steve, I call him Steve Prefontaine, had never skied. So got him rental equipment, and we were staying right on a beginner's hill, and we could go down and sort of walk over to the lift on the beginner's hill. It was about 200 yards long, the hill. So we went up to the top, and at the bottom, I kind of showed him how to snow plow and walk up the hill, sidestep a little bit, and learn how to snow plow. Took him up on this lift, and this is a reflection of Steve's personality. Got off the lift, and we're there, and in the snow plow position, and I'm showing him how to put pressure on the ski to do the turns and everything else. He gets into the snow plow position, skis straight down the hill into the hay bales at the bottom of the hill.
Oh my gosh.
Like a bullet.
Yeah. And so what does he do? He gets back up and says, I'm going back up. So, and by the end of our stay there, we had him up on the main mountain.
Wow.
Okay, that's what we did. But so we would ski in the morning, and then at 11 o'clock, we would take off, and there was an access road that went up about 3,000 feet. It was 8 miles long from the ski valley down towards town. And we would run 4 miles down that road and back up. So we ran 8 miles at 11 o'clock, came back, had lunch, skied the afternoon, and then ran from the base area up the access trails to 10,000 feet.
My goodness.
And down. Okay. One day, it was snowing, and again, you guys in Minnesota,
Right.
Every once in a while, you get what's called corn snow. It's like 32
Yes,
degree
it's
snow that
terrible.
hits you. It's like pellets. It's like kicks, and it melts as soon as it hits you. So we went out for our morning run one day, and the wind was blowing so hard, the corn snow was being blown vertical up a 9%
Oh my
grade that
gosh.
we had to work to go down.
Wow.
And what people don't know about Steve Prefontaine was that he is what I call a pisser and moaner. He complained. He loved to complain. Didn't matter what it was. He loved to complain while you're running. Dick, you know these kind
Oh
of
yeah.
guys, right? They're having a great time, but
Right.
they gotta complain. And he starts complaining, and he was just going at it. And I turned to him, and we just started down the road. And I said, Steve, no one in the world is training harder than we are right now. And he shut up for the entire run.
I love it.
He didn't say a word. So that's I don't know how we got there, but it really does, I think, show how when you find yourself improving. And again, I'd like to know about how this happened for you, Dick, because it had to be the same way. The runners come out of nowhere. In my own way, I came out of nowhere, and in your own way, you came out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. And
And
Frank, for me, training here in Minnesota, I trained. I lived in an area where I didn't have really anybody to train with. Mike would come up and visit once in a while, and it was great running with him. But I pretty much always trained here in Minnesota, even during the winter time. And I don't know, there's something about, when you're out running and it's 30 below zero and like you just mentioned, there's snow and things like that. I think it just mentally makes you tougher. And I would at the end of a run, when it's 30 below, I'm thinking nobody is doing what I'm doing today. Kind of what you thought, the same thing.
same thing.
And even if they
Same
were, in my mind, they weren't. And so that just, it just kind of builds that inner confidence inside you.
Right. Yeah. And we find our own ways, and those mental similarities are the same. And I also think, Dick, the way we are parallel, we had coaches, but I think when you train remotely like that, you really can become, to a certain degree, your own coach.
Right.
And you can report to your coach, but the way you integrate it into your training is different. Your coach isn't there watching you.
Exactly. And I think
and timing.
Right. And I think you're exactly, because, Coach Squires coached me, but, he was in Boston and I'm out here in Minnesota, and we'd report, but it's not like, like now there's so many of these big time training groups that have a coach on them, 24/7 pretty much. And which is, I guess, a good thing for the most part. But again, I think it was something that, that it made us a little tougher when we didn't have somebody just, putting a watch on us, every time we went out the door for a run.
Let's segue into that.
Yeah,
Frank,
yeah.
The Florida Track Club, I can start dropping names: Jack Batchelor, Jeff Galloway, Barry Brown, yourself. How did that group come together?
Yeah.
Oh, it was all Jack Batchelor. And Jimmy Carnes, who was the track coach, and people forget he'd actually been chosen as the Olympic coach, track and field coach in 1980.
Oh,
Yeah. And Jimmy, of his own admission, was not a good coach.
really?
He was a great organizer. He was an organizer.
Okay.
And he said, in the same way that Bill Bowerman in 72 said, look, I can't coach you guys. He was, head of the Olympic track team. He said, I can't coach you. I can just make things as easy as possible for you. And Jimmy basically did the same thing. And he used his savoir faire, is the word that comes to mind, in his own. There must be a Southern equivalent of savoir faire. And he was just smooth, but in a good way. And Jimmy was one of those guys who could get people to do things for him. Just like a great meet scheduler or
Sure.
meet director. Fred Lebo comes to
Right.
mind. He could just, because you realize he loved the sport and he loved doing what he was doing, and he and the way I always like to put it, he wasn't on his way anywhere else. He wasn't going to capitalize on it. So he starts the Florida Track Club, and Jack is sort of the first guy there, and then John Parker, whom we talked about,
Yeah.
was there, and I met Jack at the Florida Relays my senior year in college, and I met him in the 2 mile race where he finished a straightaway ahead of me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the open, it was an open 2 mile, and it's one of those things, as you know, you meet people just like with Kenny Moore. I met him at the national championship, and he went by me in the final straightaway and avoided going to Vietnam, and never told me he had to beat me to do that. I said, well, why didn't
Wow.
you tell me?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was that kind of situation, and so we jogged down, and just remembered, so that when I decided that I wanted to move to Florida to train for the Olympics, he came to mind. And again, mentor. I talked about me, Steve Prefontaine, and me training together, and I was sort of a mentor, and he acknowledged that. You see, that's what we used to do in our era, and I'm not sure they do it that much again. People who train together also mentor each other. It may go on, and so I moved down there, and what Jack taught me, he didn't teach me how to go hard. He taught me how to rest.
And that's so important.
Yeah.
He taught me how to recover.
Yep.
I mean, we never timed our easy runs. And we actually had, on our easy runs, we had a loop, and we would all warm up together with wives and dogs and everybody, for 3 miles. And then we would take off and do our run. And on that run, we went at the pace of the person who wanted to run the slowest on that day. And Dick, that you sense that.
Right.
You know who that person can be. And you just fall right in. Well, usually it was Jack, and Jack was slow. When he ran easily, they talk about conversational pace. Jack ran conversational pace. And we would actually sort of work and exclude people who didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
And so that's what and the other thing is, Jack taught me the 20-mile run, and that was his instinct. And I like to believe that, he said, no, you don't do any more than that, because you do more than you don't recover for the intervals the next
Sure.
time you do them. And I think we all found that. And then the physiologist found out that, you have 2,000 calories of glycogen stored in your body, and you use it at about 100 a mile. And so what happens when you get beyond 20 miles?
Right.
You start looking for another energy source.
Exactly.
So we were just, he was picking up on that instinctively. So he taught me that as well. I never ran more than 20 miles in training. So Jack was the person. And then socially, it was great, because John Parker and I lived together and for a while. And he's the one who convinced me to go to law school by example. He was going to law school at the time.
I'll be darned.
And yeah. So when and people may not know, I dropped out of med school because they wouldn't let me. I as an undergrad, I was a pre-med major, and I was in med school right after, and I'd had success running, and I wanted to change my training schedule, my course load,
Sure.
so that I could get sleep. That's all I wanted. I would do all that was required. I just knew I had to sleep. And my argument was, because I was a psychology major, and I said, I know a little bit about learning theory of time. And I said, staying up for 140 hours in a row isn't the best way to learn.
No.
And, so, but unfortunately, the dean at the time looked at me right in the eyes and said, but you can't do it, because this is the way I did it. and we do.
Ah,
So I couldn't change. That's when I decided to go to Florida. So I said, I'll go where the best runners are. And I felt Jack was the best in the country. So that's how I ended up with Jack.
Wow.
interesting.
Cool. Let's do some more
Okay,
name
Mikey.
game if that's all right. You know, I'm sure you've been asked this 1,000 times, Frank. You and Bill Rogers' relationship, because, you know, Bill kind of, I thought, burst on the scene, even though not too many people are aware he got third in the world cross country in 75 before Boston.
Right.
And that, very underreported in the United States. It was kind of, I think I didn't even find out until years later. And, but then when he ran that, I was starting to really follow the sport in the early 70s after you. And then, Boston Marathon, Jerome Drayton and Tom Fleming and all these great runners. And then all the ones, some guy named, and I had to laugh. Our paper didn't call him Bill Rogers. They called him Will Rogers, which I thought was the great philosopher, comedian, Will Rogers. They put it, they Will, not Bill. But I found out later it was Bill. And, wearing the T-shirt with the handwritten Boston Track Club on it and stuff. And I thought, how in the world did this guy come out of nowhere and run a 2:09:55, if I'm not mistaken? And then, he didn't, went on, and you and he tied, if I'm not mistaken, was it the 76 trials, in the marathon trials?
Well, we had an agreement that we were going to tie, and we ran together. And we ran alone at the front in the trial, and I think we went through halfway in 105.
Wow.
So we had a good lead.
Yeah.
Together. Yeah. And I think it was John Vitale who was behind us. I'm trying to remember everybody.
Right.
No. It was Don Cardone.
Don Cardone, yeah.
Yeah. And so about a half a mile from the finish in Eugene, and Tony Sandoval was there too.
Okay.
He was on his way up. Yeah. And we ended up being the top four. But about 800 meters from the finish, Bill pulled his hamstring.
Oh.
And that's what it turned out. And so he started to knot up, and I slowed down with him. And I said, "Do you want to run?" Because we were going to tie in the race.
Sure.
And he said, "No, you go on. I can finish." And he knew, because he didn't want to slow me down, which was, great.
Sure.
That's a reflection of his personality. So I think I finished 8 seconds ahead of him. But I think the more important part of the story is, at that trial, we didn't have much time before the Olympics.
Yeah, how much time did you have, Frank, back then?
Well, I think it was May.
Right.
And so we had June and July.
So not much recovery time.
No, it was about 2 months.
8 weeks.
Maybe less. Yeah. And so, I don't think his hamstring recovered. And that's what happened in the Montreal race. And so that was it. But to get back to what you said, when he had his breakthrough race, I was in that World Cross Country Championship race, and I finished, I think, 19th. And so I knew, I was not surprised when he ran 2:09:55.
Okay.
Yeah, because, I've always felt that cross country and the steeplechase are sort of bridges to the marathon. Steeplechasers, for some reason, I think some of them can become good marathon runners, and at least do well at it. And then the other is cross country.
Sure.
And so, but, Bill and I became, and we sort of overlapped in careers. We had a certain time when we overlapped a little, but I was the first part of the 70s, and he was the second part of the 70s, and one or the other, I think, almost the whole decade was ranked number one in the world.
I know. It was either you or Bill or you. It was just crazy.
So would you say it was a friendly rivalry? Very friendly rivalry?
No.
Okay.
No. No. But we did become friends after. And so, I think over time.
Sure.
And I think, again, I think that's the way all of us, can be. And I loved his story. That he says, he was a conscientious objector and working in a hospital and
Smoking.
in Hartford and smoking, and
Right.
saw me run in the Olympics and said, I can do that.
His motorcycle got
And
stolen.
people and
Yeah.
people, yeah, and people don't know that in 1967, the fall of 1967, there was a cross-country practice meet between Wesleyan and Yale on the Yale golf course. And in the fall of 1967, Amby Burfoot, Jeff Galloway, Bill Rogers, and I ran a cross-country race.
No kidding.
Wow, those three were,
Yes.
were teammates against you. How did
they
it
were teammates.
How did it end up?
I don't know. Amby probably won because he was running the best at the time. But again, I think what's interesting is I don't remember,
Yeah.
what the exact finish was. It was just the idea.
What are the odds?
And as we know historically at the time, Amby Wesleyan was Division II, and he was the perennial national Division II champion. And so, he was sort of the big guy.
And he went on in '68,
and he was older,
to win Boston in 1960.
What?
Then he wins Boston in '68, which
yeah.
to think of those four college guys in the same race in '67, and then go 10 years down the road and see how they ended up doing.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. How about let me throw another name at you, Joan Benoit Samuelson. How well do you know Joan?
Actually, very well. And I realized early on how good she was. And I'm not bragging about it. It's just I happened to be in certain places. And in the I think it was 82, there was the London Marathon. And I think it was before her Boston win.
Mm-hmm.
And Joni was in that race, and I called the race for television, NBC.
Sure.
And I watched her run, and she ran in the lead for about 20 miles. And then faded, and ironically, Lorraine Moeller won that race. And she wouldn't win her medal in the Olympics till quite a while later.
Right.
Yes. And so, but I watched it, and I'll never forget, I met Joni, and she and her mother had come over to watch her run, and they were wearing these matching Norwegian sweaters. and I walked up to them and I said, Joni, I didn't call her Joni. I said, I just want you to know you ran just right and really well. You could tell. And I think it was maybe even before Boston, maybe after, in the road race that I became involved with in my hometown, Middletown. And Dick, one of my favorite photos is on my grandmother's porch with you and me and Rod Dixon.
Frank.
At that race.
I just, I've got that picture. And in fact, I was going to bring this up, but as long as you're talking about it. So in 1982, I got invited out to the Orange Classic, 10K Classic in Frank's hometown of Middletown, New York.
Yeah.
And I remember it was a hot day, and Frank, you absolutely put the smoke on all of us that day. I mean, you beat Rod by 18, 20 seconds. I got fourth, but I'll never forget afterwards, you having us all over to your mom's place, and we're up there on the porch drinking beer, and just that was so cool.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had fun. And after that, they invited Rod because Rod was the #1 road racer at the time.
Right.
And again, why was it a surprise that later on he would, win the New York City Marathon?
Yeah.
And we you could tell these guys don't drop out of the sky. They have performances leading up to it that can tell you. Yeah, but I invited Joni to that race.
I remember she won it that year.
Yeah. And so, that and we've become good friends.
Cool.
Um, good good friends since then, and yeah, it's one of those things. And Dick, you're the same way. You can tell, you can spot people.
Sure.
You know, people think we get in a group and we start running in a group together. We've been paying attention to who was ever there for a
Oh
long
yeah.
time before that point, and we know how they run. You know, we know what their results are. We like to think we know what their strengths are, but again, you know, but Joni's just tough,
Oh, tougher than
and
nails.
and well, I think she ran the Olympic trials marathon in '84 about 17
Yeah.
days after her
Orthoscopic.
orthoscopic
Yeah,
knee surgery.
exactly. That's
And
something.
and the words she used to describe it in a sense was, well, I started out and I figured I might as well go really, really hard right from the start to see how it was going to be. You know, I call it the let's find out
Well,
attitude.
and Frank, she kind
You
of did
know,
that in the Olympic marathon. You know, she takes off after about 3 miles and nobody goes with her. And it was,
Let's find
you
out
know,
what
that's
happens.
just
yeah, Ingrid Christensen and Greta Weitz were too busy talking to each other
right.
about how that was too early.
Yes.
And and, and Ingrid, I mean, and Greta said it was the worst mistake she ever made in her life in running.
Yeah, I bet if,
Was not going with
I
Joni.
bet if she could have taken that back, she probably would have gone with her. Because you know,
Yeah,
it's like Frank, if I was running in a race against you, and all of a sudden you took off, it's like okay, it's decision time. And you look at the runners
yeah,
like yourself or Bill Rogers, you don't just let those guys go because they ain't coming back.
right. Bill does it gradually, and I like to do it earlier and harder.
Yeah,
But in a way, it was the same tactic.
sure.
Yeah, it was just Bill's was a very steady, subtle pressure that was
Right.
just kind of putting you right on the edge of going, do I really want to do this?
I hate.
Where, where, whereas with me, it was, man, I better go with
Right.
it.
I hate to do this. We're going to run long because we could spend hours and
Oh
hours.
my
And I know that, but
gosh.
I did want to bring up, you kind of said these guys don't drop out of the sky. You know where I'm heading with this, don't you? Performance enhancing drugs. And I have to compliment you, Frank. You've been a leader
No kidding.
probably since 1972. I don't know if Lassie Vera, and we can go back and rehash all that if we want, but it's hard to imagine they weren't using some artificial. But again, that it's been part of the sport now for the last 50 years. Cycling, which I've kind of gotten into lately, it's been part of that sport forever. I had a friend of mine said, Mike, professional cycling is just a dirty, dirty sport. And at that level where people are making money and sponsors are expecting results, and the Europeans take this stuff really seriously, and will use performance enhancing drugs at a very young age to try to be noticed, to try to move up in the ranks without having to, you got to have the talent. If you take a plow horse and give him a 10 or 15% improvement, you're still going to have a plow horse. But you take a race horse and give him a 10 to 15% advantage. Anyway, Frank, I know you've been on commissions. You've led the charge on trying to help. I don't know what's the word I should try to use. Manage,
Stop
control,
it.
stop it. I think it's an added. Yeah,
maybe,
go ahead.
maybe the fancy college word is mitigate.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because it's a moral decision. Dick and I have had this conversation. I'm glad I was never given the opportunity, never saw the opportunity, never knew how to pursue the opportunity, because human nature being what it is, Dick got to where he was on pure hard work and natural ability. I got where I was on pure hard work and natural ability. Dick, I'm going to brag. Dick ran 208. I ran 218. I wanted to, I always said if it didn't happen to me, I'm glad it happened to Dick. Because when you know somebody personally, you kind of, you want people to be, I want to be successful in whatever I do. And if I get successful, but I want super success, but I see my best friend get it, I am so happy. And so if somebody would have said, hey, Mike, I think we can help you get there. Wow. That's that I almost said come to Jesus moment, where the rubber hits the road. What kind of person are you going to be? You know, are you going to take a shortcut, or are you going to say no? You know, that's not right. I commend you, Frank. Going to 10,000 feet elevation was a commitment financially. I mean, so many ways, personally, your family, all that. But I think you recognize this is something I can do, definitely legitimately, definitely legally, to help
Well, and Frank,
take me to that level.
nowadays, anytime somebody runs fast, it's like, oh, they must, just like this gal that a couple of weeks ago ran
20,
28:40 for
46.
10K. I mean, come on. I mean, and it seems like these athletes are one step in front of the testers as far as figuring this out. I mean, what are your thoughts on this whole thing?
There you go. That's where I was trying to get to.
Yeah, it's first off, um, I'd like to bring up a name that many people probably don't know outside of cycling, but his name is Andy Hampsten.
Sure.
And Andy Hampsten was in cycling, they say, domestique for Greg LeMond when Greg LeMond won the Tour de France. And Andy was actually a very, very good rider at the same time. He in the Giro d'Italia, he won the climb up Alpe d'Huez, which is one of the premier stages of any cycling race in the world, in the snow. LeMond retires, and I'll parenthetically say I think LeMond is probably the last clean cycling champion.
Yeah.
And Andy was the heir apparent. But at the time, the EPO and the blood doping had and human growth hormone were coming in, and Andy decided to retire. And I knew him in Boulder. He actually bought the house he lives in now from me.
Oh, wow.
And I knew Andy a long time, and I go for rides with him when I started to do duathlons, and Andy retired, went to Europe, started bike tours, and said, "I'm not doing this." And so there are people, and I sort of like to, think I was of the same mode. I think I came along at a time when maybe the steroids kind of worked their way up the ladder in terms of distance.
Sure.
They creeped up, and then finally the distance runners found out, well, yeah, you can do intervals and you recover, and you can do 3 times a week rather than 1 or 2.
Yeah.
And not gain weight, not gain muscle mass. But before that, I think I benefited from that. Then when they started to come out, I for whatever reason, I just decided I wouldn't do it. Now, I used to joke about it and say, well, I know enough about this that I didn't want to risk my health,
Sure.
And so in a way I was saying, well, I was just chicken because, no, it, and at the time in 1974 at Cooper's Aerobics Institute, they brought a bunch of us down to test us runners, and there were Kenyan high school kids and US high school kids to see if there was any kind of difference in, say, VO2 max. And there was. The Kenyans had genetically an advantage.
Okay.
And they were testing all sorts of other stuff, but it was one of the first psychological profile tests. And it was 1974. And one of the questions was, if you were to take drugs that you knew would get you a medal in the Olympic Games, but you would die younger, would you take them? And I think the figure is, I think it was 42% of the answers were yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's always there. And all you have to do is look at Kenya, and it's an assumed risk. Now, I don't mean assumed risk. It is a risk that basically every Kenyan runner is willing to take, because the money is so important.
Okay.
If you can avoid detection for 2 years on the world scene, you can go home with any prize money you have and become the patriarch or matriarch of an extended family and retire.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so it's in weighing the risk. And then the other thing is when they say that they're always ahead of the testers, yes, it's true. What, as I said, mitigates that is the keeping of the samples. So the one thing you can do is really, really test, which means countries that give lip service to testing have to actually test and then also allow an incredible amount of out of country entities coming in to test them and facilitating that as much as possible because the deterrent is what is the profiling now. In other words, you look at profiles over time, and that really is the way
Sure.
to do it. And the start of that was something that, and I hope this isn't too obscure, it took a long time to do this because early on when we were running, they said, well, no positive test. Well, what can you do? Well, the first thing that happened was 1983. They raided the Balco labs and got all this info on people, and that was the records. So we made it so that records could disqualify you, your medical records. Then it came the profiling, and that's when you had the Lance Armstrong thing by about 2012. So it shows you how slowly this
Yeah.
goes. 2003 to 2012, and he was disqualified more on the profile in the variations. And as an aside, he got so paranoid about EPO tests that he went back to blood doping. And that's why they would stop the bus on the side of the road and take blood out and put it back in. And
Wow.
because they were afraid to do EPO because of the hematocrit test. I'm the EPO test, and once they started to see hematocrits, they could see that if your blood had all these new red cells in it, that's not the way it works. You could look at the percentages of new cells. So I hope I'm not being too
No,
obscure
it's
here.
very.
No.
But
The point
it's
is,
good.
and then it got to the point where now, yes, the profiling can be done. And the other thing that is happening is that a lot of races, we had a race in New York, which for a different reason, the New York Marathon, withheld prize. They all can withhold prize money now, pending,
Yeah, the
subsequent
outcome.
testing. Yeah, and I think it should be a strict liability thing so that, um, and people are going to disagree with me, but say you win a marathon and you don't test positive, and then um, you run another marathon and you're tested and you test positive. What does that mean?
Exactly.
Oh, when I won the money before, I wasn't doping, but now, yeah, but you can't take away that money that I won then. And I think they have to figure out some way to penalize, and maybe it's not, well, no, for you. I guess you get to keep the money that for which you weren't tested positive, but the ban is lifetime.
Yes, that's what I agree. Lifetime ban right from the get-go, and that might help corral it a little bit.
Well, I think what you're talking about, Frank, too, is the
Yeah.
biological passport is what I think the term is where if you take a young athlete who shows real potential, I could think of, we had a kid from South Dakota, Simeon Birnbaum, who is just phenomenal. The kid ran a sub 4 at age 16. I think he was a junior. And then the youngest American kid ever to do it. And then he's at Oregon now as a freshman. And geez, I've got great hopes for him to, what a talent. But you can test him now and say, well, let's look at his VO2. Let's look at his, many factors. chemically. And over the next several years, as he hopefully develops and becomes hopefully an international competitor, I think what you're talking about is all at once a sudden something changed more than nature could have possibly allowed. And so, that I think it will help tremendously as well. But, and we are going to, last thing, super shoes, Frank, we old timers have a real problem with super shoes because we didn't get the benefit of using the darn things. And I've had the analogy of, well, the pole vaulters use bamboo. I think of Bob Richards, the vaulting Viker. That guy won a couple gold medals. I can't even imagine the poles he was using, and I think it went over 16, 17
Yep.
feet. And then I think of Bob Segrin came along at Munich, and they threw the poles he qualified with were not allowed at the Olympics. Ended up getting the silver to a German, surprisingly, because the East German, because the
Right.
officials said, no, you can't use those poles. They haven't been available.
Well, East Germany was the country that complained and said we didn't have these for practice.
Yeah, they didn't have an
therefore you can't.
opportunity
Oh,
long
boy.
enough, and so they agreed. And he had to use a pole that he hadn't used for a while. But bless his heart, finished second. He was a gold medalist in '68, I believe. But anyway, any thoughts? I've had people say, Mike, get over it. It's technology, computers, calculators. I mean, things have progressed. We don't use the abacus anymore, and things like this. And so, what's your thoughts?
Well, this comes back to my thoughts on what if. And it can work both ways. And again, Dick, I think we had an attitude towards our training and competing where we didn't want to ever be in a position to look back and say, well, what if?
Exactly.
What if I had? And you have to bear with me here. And yes, you can, in a way, you would have to do the same. I would have to do the same thing with regard to the super shoes, because if I say, well, what if I had them? I can't go there.
No.
And the other reason is it's being shown that certain people
benefit more. Yeah.
benefit more from these shoes than others. And so in a way, it's introduced a factor that was similar but not the same as the drug enhancement factor.
Right.
Because some people respond to drugs better than others.
High responder. Yeah.
Yeah, and I always held that Lance Armstrong, I called them leapfroggers. He responded better. And that's based on a Soviet weightlifter from the 1960s, 1968, when the steroids were first coming in. His name was Alexiev. And in 1 year, he went from fifth best to best in the Soviet Union, leapfrogged all the other weightlifters. My theory is he responded better.
Sure.
And so I can't have an opinion for myself on this because I have no idea. I can't find out.
Yeah, good
whether
point.
I was a leapfrogger or didn't respond.
Yeah.
So that's how I feel.
Well, we are creeping up on the hour. We try to keep this under an hour. I know some people we might have put to sleep. I doubt it, but Frank, I'm going to kind of wrap up here and say thank you. I really appreciate
Oh my gosh!
What an opportunity
from the bottom of our hearts.
Yeah, I there could be a T-shirt in it for you someday if we cross paths. Anyway, and so
well, I hope not.
Yeah, just what you need.
Well, one last story about Frank. He came to the running camp that Dick hosted, and Frank, I have to admit, that was the first time I ever met you, and you were so gracious. And what I was impressed with, and I love Dick for the same reason. People have success, and sometimes it changes them. They become I don't know what the word is, arrogant, full of themselves, cocky. Let's just go there. And I didn't pick up on that from you at all. And if anybody had the right to be, it might have been. And I'm kind of glad, because sometimes when you meet I hate to say your heroes, they disappoint you, and that's a gut punch. and you were so gracious. And I remember you were, I'm not going to divulge any information here. You actually gave out your private email to some of the campers graciously and said, if there's something I can do, and I can't remember this, but you were very open and willing to help anybody at any time. And I think that's a commendable
Well, and I
personality
gotta-
to have.
But just to qualify, no, I really need to qualify that at this time. And it was always in a way that said, if your coach wants to contact me, it was not direct contact. Okay.
And
But
I
still.
got to say one last thing too about Frank. Just shows you the type of person he is. And again, he's so high up on the mountain when it comes to what he's done athletically and running and everything. But when I lost my son Andy on October 4th of 2015, I was back out in Bonesteel, South Dakota, where Andy is buried. This is a couple months after, or maybe a month after. Anyhow, I'm out there all by myself, out on Lake Francis Case, part of the Missouri River system, in my boat, just kind of
fishing.
It was still hard to fathom what had happened. And my phone rang, and at the time it didn't have caller ID or anything, and I answered it, and it was Frank. And Frank just told me, he says, Dick, he said, I'm really sorry to hear about your son, and if there's anything I can do to help, if you need just to talk to somebody, I'm here for you. And that, Frank, I can't even begin to tell you what that meant to me at that time and still to this day. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for that. Thank you for all you've done for running and whatnot in our country and around the world. And thank you so much for being on with Dunn and I today. It's just been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah. And Dick, I sent you a picture. You can use that picture.
It's a great picture, Frank. Now, Frank, you're 76
That's
years
what I
old.
look like now.
You're 76, and you look like $1 million. You still looks like you could go out and gosh dang run a 2:10 marathon.
I love it.
Well, don't get your hopes up. But the other thing is, maybe you could use that picture and somehow get it in.
For sure.
We will.
We will.
Telecast. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So that's what I look like now.
Well, you look great, Frank, and we want to thank you, and we want to thank everybody for listening today. And if you have any questions for us or comments about our show, you can contact us directly on our website at beardsanddunpod.com, or you can leave us a comment on our Facebook, Instagram, or X, all at Beards and Dun Pod.
Yeah, and if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit the comment, subscribe, and if you enjoyed the podcast, we actually still have some merchandise available on our website, so don't be afraid to go check that out. Dick, Frank, this has been a highlight of my life. There's
Absolutely.
no doubt about it, and I sure appreciate both of you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Frank.
Love you all.
Love you too.
Bye-bye. Take care.